Tax reform, potential impacts and journey to adequacy. Main disagreement, controversial or probable points. General aspects of duration and transition period. Expectations concerning transition time and impact of the reform proposals. Concerns about calculation, accuracy, and accounting. Impacts. Practical aspects of the transition in the fiscal area, fiscal documents, and accounting. Relevant challenges for IT operations, infrastructure, migration, and customization in ERPs. Speakers. Mediators. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Fernando Silva. I'm the head for Latin America at Vertex. Thank you for your presence. Today we have more than 520 participants in many countries as the event has simultaneous translation. The topic is very relevant given the current situation: tax reform, the potential impact, and the journey towards adequacy. The event was organized by Systax, a Brazilian company, the only company with a systematic base of content applied to the business rules in the local market, including more than 20 million rules in its database, and Vertex, a 40-year-old American company with more than 4,500 clients all over the world, serving more than 170 countries. Recently, it partnered with Systax to work in the Brazilian market. According to our agenda, let me introduce our guests. I greet all the guests, starting by the moderators. Gerson Prochnow, CEO of Systax. Good morning, Gerson. Ana Paula Maciel, Content Manager at Vertex, lawyer and tax specialist. Carolina Veloso Virginelli, partner at Deloitte in the tax area. Marcos Vinicius Neder, partner at Trench, Rossi & Watanabe Advogados, and former Undersecretary of the Federal Revenue Service. Tatiane Piscitelli, a law professor at FGV and president of the Tax Law Commission at OAB, the Brazilian Bar Association, São Paulo. And Eudaldo Almeida de Jesus, tax auditor from CEPAS Bahia and general coordinator of ENCAT. It's a pleasure to have you all here to discuss such an important topic. Good morning, everyone. Enjoy the event. I hand it over to Gerson for his initial remarks. Thank you, Fernando. Good morning, everyone. We are very excited with the first meeting promoted jointly with Vertex, a company with which we have worked together since 2016 and partners since the beginning of this year, as Fernando said. As co-founder and CEO of Systax, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, albeit virtually. I would like to thank you for your participation and attention. I will also thank the Systax and Vertex teams that joined efforts to make this a great event. And I thank the panelists who kindly share their time and knowledge with us to contribute to such a relevant discussion. The tax reform is knocking at our doors, and although it will bring positive results, we need to be prepared. My gratitude to the panelists is prior to this event. I have known Carolina since the beginning of Systax inside Fiscosoft, when she already shared her knowledge in events like this one. The same goes to Marcos Vinicius, with whom I've learned a lot since the 90s, when we were colleagues at the Federal Revenue Office. I met Eudaldo in 2005, when I was appointed by the Revenue Office to contribute to the projects of the electronic invoice and the electronic bill of lading, both conducted by ENCAT, the National Meeting of State Coordinators and Tax Managers. His coordination was brilliant. I have not known Dr. Tatiana for very long, but enough to express my gratitude as well. This meeting was designed to be practical, direct, and objective, focusing both on the legal aspects and on business operations, and on the impacts it may have mainly in the IT and tax areas. We intend to go beyond the concepts and discuss the pains, the impact on businesses, processes, systems, and teams. Maybe today we won't have final answers because at this point the reform brings lots of doubts and uncertainties. But opinions and debate will allow us to be more prepared to plan the journey to compliance. Tax reform is not a new topic, but it's hotter now than before. In the last decades, we heard a lot about reforms, and I was very skeptical about the possibilities of a comprehensive reform in Brazil that might change the relations between the federal entities. But the fact is that we have three proposals, two PECs, the Constitutional Amendment Bill, and a multifaceted reform, as in draft bill proposed by the executive. It seems there is a consensus about the need for a reform, therefore this is a special moment. It's very important to discuss the current scenarios. I mean, a timeline, not only the current stage and the approval in Congress, but mainly the consequences, transitions included. For example, if we start with the CBS, which expects a 6-month transition period, this would delay the ICMS reform. The current PECs suggest 5 to 8 years. And this is what I mean. What companies may expect in the next 10 to 12 years. This is the main point we will try to clarify today. So I hand over to Ana. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you for your participation in this webinar, as well as the support team and the interpreters. Our webinar today will be conducted as an interview where we will ask questions directly to the panelists. In the end, we will have 15 minutes for Q&A. You may send your questions at any time through our chat, and we have already received some and will select those that are of general interest to be answered in the end if we have time. I would like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and you may access it on this channel, the YouTube. Afterwards, we will send the link to all participants. Well, to start our webinar, I invite Dr. Tatiana to introduce herself and provide a brief explanation about the current proposals. Why two of them are constitutional amendments and one is a bill? What are the main differences between them and what is the necessary legislative process to approve the two types of proposals? And what are the differences and similarities between them? Good morning to you all. I would like to thank Systax for the invitation and to congratulate you on this initiative. This event is absolutely fundamental because we really need to understand what are the impacts caused by the changes in the tax system. These changes will naturally impact businesses and the civil society. It's very important to debate, to participate in events like this. Ana and Gerson, I congratulate you and all the other panelists. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Based on Ana's provocation, I will speak briefly about the current proposals and their impact. We may have further questions about the impacts later. Before talking about the proposed constitutional amendment and about the bill presented by the federal government, as Gerson mentioned, I would like to take a step back to put this moment and the current debate about the tax reform in context. It goes without saying that we're facing an unprecedented health crisis. The online format of this event only corroborates this fact, and social distancing is a reality. This health crisis has economic and financial impacts. It impacts public accounts. It's important to understand the scenario behind the tax reform, to question if this is the right time to conduct a tax reform and what type of reform, as Gerson said. Everybody agrees that we need a tax reform, but which reform and which proposals are there? So, to put it briefly into context, as everybody knows, in the beginning of the pandemic, Brazil was already facing an uncomfortable situation, both in the economical and financial perspectives. We were already facing a fiscal crisis, and in January it was considered that 2020 would close with primary deficit, or rather deficit on public accounts around 124 billion reais. 2020 already started with an economic crisis. Businesses were not performing well. A crisis that started in 2015, or rather in the second semester of 2014 in Brazil. This was the scenario when the pandemic hit Brazil. What happened in the pandemic? The situation, which was not good, got worse. Today, deficit is estimated to be 820 billion reais, which is an optimistic view. Some estimates say 1 trillion deficit in the perspective of the government. In September, the numbers for the second semester were announced and showed the worst historical fall of the GDP, as you all know, around 9.7%. And the service sector, which historically is not affected by the crisis, ranked second as the most affected. Well, this is the context where we discuss tax reform. As Gerson said, the discussion is not new. Since the enactment of the 1988 Constitution, we have been discussing tax reform, and there were several constitutional amendments proposed along the way. But last year, the discussion gained new momentum with the proposal of the constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment number 45, which proposed a constitutional change. It's a proposal of a constitutional amendment to reform taxation on consumption. The pandemic began with this proposal on the table. With the pandemic, it's necessary to reevaluate if this proposal still makes sense or if it makes sense to adopt the model proposed in this economic and social moment Brazil is facing. This is the question I will try to answer here in these few initial minutes. So if we look at what was on the table, as Anna said, we have PEC 45, which is this constitutional amendment, a rule that aims at changing the constitution, and together with PEC 45, we have another one, PEC 110. It also aims at reforming taxation on consumption, but PEC 110 is not as broadly discussed. It's more of a political movement from the Senate to gain political prominence in the tax reform. The PEC 45 is pending in the Chamber of Deputies, which would be the House of Representatives in the US. Now they're talking about joining both proposals, a convergence of ideas there included. Time is short, so I will focus on PEC 45. What do we have? The federal government was elected. Well, Bolsonaro was elected with a reformist proposal. I will reform Social Security, I will conduct administrative reform, and finally the tax reform. During these 2 years of administration, people expected the tax reform as promised, as the Social Security reform was approved, and were also waiting the administrative reform. And after some wait, the economy minister affirmed, we will present our tax reform. But as Gerson said, in phases. We will first present a bill that also focuses on taxation on consumption as all PECs, and later we will think of taxing income, excise tax, and other types of reform of the federal tax system. So let's start with taxation on consumption. What we have on the table today are proposals that focus on reforming taxation on consumption. ICMS, ISS, PIS, PIS, COFINS, IPI. This is what is under discussion. This said, what are the characteristics of each proposal? PEC 45, this proposal of constitutional amendment, aims at promoting a change in the Constitution by unifying taxes on consumption in Brazil. It intends to unify 5 taxes into only one. It will unify ICMS, PIS, COFINS, IPI in one single tax, the IBS, Tax on Goods and Services. What is the central characteristic of the IBS? Apart from being totally non-cumulative with no restrictions, there would be a dogma to be followed, the prohibition to grant any tax incentive. So, IBS would have a uniform rate regardless of the type of service. There would be a single rate for all operations. This alone will have an important impact on businesses because they operate from certain regions to enjoy tax incentives offered by the local governments. So to ensure a safer transition period for these companies, there's time. The PEC estimates a 10-year transition from the current model to the proposed one. Later, we should look at the practical implications because we might have 2 models simultaneously as the 10-year transition period is progressive. There's another point I would want to mention here. The total lack of tax benefits works against the complexity of our country. Brazil is a very unequal country in social terms as well as in regional terms. And this pandemic exacerbated these inequalities. The number of deaths in the outskirts of the cities is higher, as well as the number of deaths among Black people. But why? Does the virus attack more the poor? No, it's due to lack of access. The pandemic made it very clear. Well, by proposing a single rate for all goods and services, we do not take into consideration those inequalities, which may bring major problems in terms of tax equity and economic efficiency of a country. No one doubts that a more equal country is economically more efficient. So, to keep track of time, apart from the proposal to unify taxation on consumption with a long transition period, which would add complexity to the companies and, on the other hand, may increase social inequality once a cell phone will pay the same IBS rate as rice and beans. We're talking about a 25% rate, which is not low. So the basic basket that today pays 7% of ICMS, for example, would pay 25%. In this scenario of pandemic, economic and social crisis, the federal government submits a draft bill creating a new contribution. How is this new contribution? The new tax provides for the merge of PIS and COFINS, which everyone knows. The merge of PIS and COFINS, and then a new tax on goods and services. There are many problems in this proposal because the idea is to create a tax model based on value added, but there are many questions about credital settlement and the taxable event itself. So we will discuss it later. What I mean now is that according to the draft bill, where the model of approval is simpler than a proposal of constitutional amendments, therefore easier to be approved in the Congress, the tax rate of this new tax would be 12%, eliminating the differences between sectors or regimes. It eliminates the cumulative PIS/COFINS. The one remaining is the non-cumulative CBS, and the service sector, which is highly affected in the pandemic, would go from a low taxation of 3.65 to 12% with a limited possibility of credit settlement, as the service sector expenses are mostly labor expenses. So how would this sector be affected? To make things worse, CBS would be a test for IBS, as proposed by PEC 45 and reaffirmed by Paulo Guedes many times. A CBS with a 12% tax rate would require an IVA, or an IBS with a much higher rate. It's estimated that the merge of CBS and IBS is what the Ministry of Economy wants, will result in one of the highest value-added taxes in the world, with a tax around 30 to 32%. This coupled with high labor taxes. What is being discussed, in my opinion, is nonsense. A significant increase in the tax burden, especially for some sectors, in a scenario of economic slowdown, a scenario of crisis in sectors that historically are not affected by crisis, and a scenario of deeper inequalities. That is why I said in the beginning, it's very important to have this debate. We need to ask ourselves if this is the right moment to conduct this tax reform, or if we should focus on simplifying the ancillary obligations, making the country more efficient in a different way. As I said, this is almost a dogma to have a unified taxation on consumption simply for the sake of simplification. Simplification can't be a value in itself. We must consider the impact on society, and in my point of view, they may be very harmful. I will stop now in order not to be too long. I'm available for questions. Unfortunately, my initial message is not very encouraging. This is what I have to share. Thank you. Thank you, Tatiane. The discussion of a standard single tax rate reminds me of the high school philosophy classes. I do not know much about philosophy, but I remember I taught a lesson on equality, that being equal is not treating everyone the same way, but unequally according to their inequalities, or something like that. It suits Brazil very well. On the other hand, it means that we have 20 million tax rules in the syntax database. This is the other extreme. There are lots of exceptions. Now I would like to invite Eudaldo to give us his personal opinion on the context of the reform, the study, and the recent actions of the state and ENCAT. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's an important opportunity. Thank you for the chance of participating in such a prominent group. I have known Gerson for many years, since the time of the Federal Revenue Office, Marcos, Tatiane, Carolina, and Ana Maciel. Professor Tatiane gave us a summarized class, a great synthesis capacity. about the proposals of tax reform and the movement we are facing in Brazil. I agree with Tatiane a lot. What happens? We started to discuss in practical terms with the proposal for tax reform on the table in 1995 with the PEC 175. I don't know if you remember that. We had several meetings in the Secretary at the time of late friend Rodolfo Rolim, who was Treasury Secretary in Bahia, and the Governor Paulo Souto. Soon I realized that when I took office in the tax era in 1966, 98, maybe 97, if we spent too much time discussing that topic at that moment, there was no structured proposal to become a tax reform into practice. I was right. I would have lost the focus of managing the daily chores of a superintendent. What I see now is a different scenario. Now, the crisis provides the best prerequisites or possibilities for a tax reform in political terms due to the need to unlock the country in the Congress. But I do not see a structured proposal that we could say, this is it. The academia, the business community, the tax authority are heads down in this proposal because it really helps the country. To have a better vision, I would not like to be in the rapporteur's shoes in the Chamber of Deputies when this proposal will be presented this month, maybe next month. So this proposal will be the moment to focus in a structured manner. So this is an excellent moment to discuss it, but we must debate something structured. At ENCAT, we have been discussing possibilities. One of them is that does not seem that any one of the proposals could be implemented in a 6-month period, a very short term, albeit experimentally, with a reduced tax rate around 1%. Because there are legacy systems in the companies and in the states that need to be updated because of the changes. So, at first, I think that the country is willing to reform. We're spending a lot of time discussing the proposals, but in order for it to mature, it should take at least 6 months to a year to be sure of the way. We can't make mistakes. We can't put the country in a situation worse than it is today. Any proposal of reform, albeit good, will require efforts from tax managers and taxpayers who have their integrated systems, and some of which quite complex, such as the ERPs, as you know, on the big companies, which sometimes require help from other countries to change. So in short, we have major possibilities for this reform, and ENCAT will say more in the future. But first, we need a good proposal, and second, it needs to mature some adjustments so that the country has a reasonable proposal. Thank you, Eudaldo. You really made a good point. Brazilian taxpayers are waiting for a tax reform since 1995. Let's hope this time we get something well-grounded, something which is feasible, to have it really simplified and to meet the goals for which it was created. Carolina, I would like to invite you, Carol, to introduce yourself and tell us what is your level of optimism in face of the proposals presented until now. In your personal opinion, what would be the probable points to be approved? What is the likelihood of approval? Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank Vertex and Systax for the invitation and greet all the panelists. It's a great pleasure to be here to discuss such an important topic for our country. Before addressing the tax reform, I would like to mention many of the main drivers for this reform and then discuss the mood of the business community in relation to the tax reform. Just for the sake of context, why tax reform is so urgent? There are many reasons for this. Brazil has now one of the most complex tax systems in the world. The cost of compliance in Brazil is huge. Studies indicate that approximately 1.5% of companies' income is spent annually with compliance. High tax burden, a huge difficulty to cope with all the rules that are published. An interesting but sad study from IBPT showed that we had more than 290,000 rules, which roughly estimate means 2 rules published every hour, every business day. It's very difficult to follow up the proposal and the approval of new rules in Brazil. To add to this difficulty, credit period for taxes in most cases is not aligned with the company's receivables from the sales of products and the rendering of services. So we have a case of tax substitution where the substitute prepays all ICMS of the chain and maybe prior to receiving this amount from his client. It makes working capital complex and costly. And many sectors have difficulties to monetize their tax credits. So credit accumulation are difficult. IPI, ICMS, many times they can't monetize these amounts, which will have major impacts on the company's balance sheet. Tax calculation in-house adds complexity, and it's being discussed in the proposals. And because of all of this situation, the many interpretations, the Brazilian tax system is subject to judicial decisions. It's estimated that 60% of the Brazilian GDP results from the tax discussions. Because of this scenario, Brazil is considered the 134th position among 190 as the worst tax system in the world, according to a study of the World Bank. That is, we have many reasons for a tax reform. On the other hand, I have to agree with Tatiane and Eudaldo in the sense that we need a tax reform. It's necessary, but the question is, which reform? It's important and it's necessary for all the reasons already mentioned. But we need a basis and we need a deep discussion about what to do. Looking briefly at the proposals, as Tatiane already mentioned, PEC 45, which is quite strict in the sense that it will create a single tax rate. As Tatiane said, it does not take into account regional specificities, the importance of certain consumer goods, such as food, education, and health, to the detriment of other goods that may be less important. So the master line of this PEC 45 does not offer tax breaks or tax incentives, which may cause losses and inequalities. Another interesting point is that PEC 45 defines a federal IBS, which means that the IBS will be disciplined by the federal government. The two main criticisms to PEC 45 are related to the strictness of this proposal, the issue of a single tax and the inexistence of tax incentives. This goes against what most of the OECD countries do. If we analyze the OECD studies, taxation on consumption varies between 2 or more tax rates to take into account sector specificities. On top of this, a major risk of the PEC 45 is the federal jurisdiction, the federal government to establish the IBS. It may harm the federative pact. This is another criticism we have been hearing and discussing in relation to PEC 45. On the other hand, PEC 110, which is similar to PEC 45, also establishes the IBS, but with a state jurisdiction. Contrary to PEC 45, that merges 5 taxes on consumption, PIS, COFINS, ICMS, IPI, ISS, PEC 110, in addition to those above mentioned, also includes CIG and salary education. So there's a greater consolidation of the current taxes. The PEC 110 is less strict than the 45. It provides the possibility to have differentiated rates and fiscal benefits for some important sectors. Anyway, when PEC 45 reached the CCJ, the Constitution and Justice and Citizenship Commission, it was highly questioned in relation to the existence of one single tax, a single IVA, and it was presented to CCJ the possibility to have a dual IVA, a dual IBS, which would be a federal IBS unifying state and municipal taxes. This may address the concern of this loss of autonomy and the impact on federative pact. Apart from the PECs, as Tatiane mentioned, there is also the phased tax reform by the government, the campaign pledges of promoting taxes, administrative and social security reforms. So the government needed and presented a proposal for a tax reform, but in parts. The first proposal is to create a CBS, which is the merging of PIS and COFINS, that have been discussed in previous governments. We had this discussion in the Dilma and Temer administrations, and now finally we have a proposal to merge PIS and COFINS, obviously with some changes. The government intends to change IPI, the income tax, and to reduce the payroll taxation, apart from the old discussion that hovers in the air of the possibility of bringing back the IPMF. Talking strictly about CBS and some points of attention, the CBS will be levied on all sales of goods and services at a 12% tax rate and also on imported goods and services. I would like to ask questions now. We will have once again a legislation which will start creating a concept for goods and services. We discussed for years which services this ISS will affect, which the ICMS is left on, and again, we will have a legislation in this area without solving this problem. I put this question to you. CBS credit differs from PIS and COFINS, which is a base-to-base credit, or base against base. I have the expense total amount on my 925 rate on the cumulative against the amount of taxable income. It's a base-to-base. The CBS proposal is similar to what ICMS today, which is tax against tax. What's stated in the tax invoice could be credited, a controversial aspect that Tatiana already mentioned. Another important point I would like to discuss further is the implementation. The government establishes that CBS effectiveness would occur 6 months after publication. I ask myself how the companies will implement and modify ERP systems, tax engines in 6 months. This is a huge challenge. Maybe for some companies it will be difficult to adapt. Another question to ask. The CBS calculation base is gross revenue. Again, a controversial point that I will not address now, but we're going over to the same point, the taxation on the gross revenue. Now, apart from the reform projects, I would like to mention other projects which the federal government considers as reform projects, not a global reform, but a reform within the tax system. That would be our projects of Brazilian digital service tax. There are today 3 specific proposals being discussed, 3 draft bills being discussed. One of them is the creation of the digital CIDE, CIDE, and tax rates vary from 3 to 5% and would include online advertising companies, marketplace companies, as well as the sales of users' data in Brazil. The second project is a digital COFINS with a huge tax rate of 10.6%. Even the setting up of the tax rate is different if we consider the many projects in this sector. The 10.6% tax rate would impact online advertising companies and marketplace companies. The last supplementary draft bill is the CSSD, which contemplates a 3% tax rate that brings complexity to the tax, as it would tax digital services. Again, it's a matter of interpretation. What are digital services? The STF, the High Court, has not decided yet what taxes are levied on software. It's a matter of changing the legislation, creation of new taxes, and we would end up solving these topics on the courts as we do today. Thank you, Carolina. Now I would like to give the floor to Marcos Vinicius to introduce himself and to present his personal opinion on the context of the reforms. Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank Vertex and Systax for the invitation, and Gerson, who is always gentle. It's a pleasure to debate and complement what was said by the illustrious panelists. It's a pleasure to discuss this topic. In reality, we are discussing tax reform again. I always joke that Brazilians like to discuss soccer and tax reform. I have been discussing tax reform for 25 years, and I always tell my students that the big tax reform was CTN, the Brazilian Tax Code, and Brazil did not have all this debate. After that, we sat down many times, but there are always winners and losers. In a democratic regime, we need power to approve a reform of such magnitude. Actually, Brazil is an atypical country. Just imagine that we're facing the worst crisis in our history. People are dying, we're locked at home, and our stock exchange is bullish, hitting records. Interest rates are at historical lows, low inflation. Go figure, Brazil. We also have a moment of a weak government. The other day I saw the evolution of vetoes overturned by the president. In the Fernando Henrique administration, there was only one veto overturned. Here we have dozens of vetoes, which shows that the government does not have a majority in Congress, has great difficulties to rule, and PACs require 3/5 of the votes. Thus, it's very difficult to have a clear forecast. The Social Security reform was approved, which is great news. Many times unexpected. Characteristics of the PACs 45 and 110, which are not a governmental initiative. For a long time, I worked at the Federal Revenue Services, and I was responsible for the approval of legislative measures. And there was a motto that the proposals that were approved were those supported by the government. All important laws in the tax law were government initiatives, and these two, one proposed by the Congressman Baleia Rossi and the other one by the Congressman Hawley, were not proposed by the government. Furthermore, there's an open fight between the Minister Guedes and the President of the Chamber of Deputies, Maia. It's a difficult and challenging situation. Brazil needs the reform. I'm convinced that it does. I'm convinced. Even before I started working as a lawyer, and now I'm absolutely sure that we need it. The system is too complex, totally uncertain, and extremely unequal. It's very difficult to convince a foreign investor to invest in Brazil. He says, look, I analyzed your case and it's favorable. 2 years later, he's notified by the tax authority with a penalty of 150% and faces fraud investigation. Then he comes and says, you told me it was safe. Yes, it was, but not anymore. So it's very difficult. A peculiarity of our tax system, I could say, it's analogical, but the tax management is digital. Because we collect taxes very well. If we look at the 10, 15 years history, receipts in real terms increased almost 10 times. It's an impressive result. We have SPED, Gerson can witness that. The electronic invoice, he was key in those pioneer systems. Everything works well, despite the confusion of the tax system. So there are these two PACs, 45 and 110, which are a bit different, but both aim at simplifying, and the one moving faster is the 45. It was already approved by the Legal Commission and now is being discussed in the Special Commission, and President Maia supported strongly. It has a long transition period, 10-year implementation period, and it may reach 50 years for set-offs, creating IBS with a 25% tax rate. Actually, what is the goal of this reform? It has good ideas. It wants a good IVA, an European standards IVA, with some requirements: broad base, broad credit, single rate, not to interfere in the different levels of the chain. The final consumer will pay. It does not include tax incentives. This is the ideal world. Implementation is already failing in many aspects. I particularly disagree a bit with the previous visions. I think we have an excess of tax incentives. This does not make the system more equal. It makes the system unequal. For a long time, I saw how lobbies worked. In Brazil, you can't say the richer pay more taxes. You can't say the poorer are favored. In this reform, this is a positive point. It's not unfavorable. It's difficult to implement. So, in the context, I see good things in these reforms. But as Eualdo said, the moment seems better than the previous ones. This competition of the fiscal war led to decreased revenues. The ICMS base is emptied by the service sector. So maybe he can tell better than me. I see greater support from the governors to the proposal, but I see great difficulty. Look at the idea from the federal government to start with CBS, and in practice, it's too far from the model of the good IVA I have mentioned, with many problems. We will address this later. This would be a first intervention and an approach to the topic. Thank you, Gerson. Thank you, Marcos. Tatiane, could you comment, based on what we have already discussed, what would be your understanding about the probability among the points presented in the proposals? What would be more likely to occur in the current context? For the approval, you mean? Look, I agree, of course, that the excessive granting of tax incentives generates a distortion, and this results in the fiscal war. This competition between the states to attract investment through grants of tax breaks unconstitutionally. In my perception, there is a huge gap between zero tax incentives and the myriad of problems we have today. We need to compromise. It does not seem that PEC 45, which proposes the absolute absence of tax incentives, is the right model for approval. Because, as I said briefly, Brazil is an unequal country from the regional point of view. Apart from this regional inequality in that some states do need to grant tax incentives to attract companies, constitutionally speaking, without unconstitutional benefits, there are other points related to the Brazilian economy that also depend on the granting of tax incentives, such as the development of a more sustainable economy. So, as I say frequently, the development of sustainable energy sources, such as wind energy, biofuels, the development of these areas depend on the granting of tax incentives. They are based on this today. How can we meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, for example, in relation to the environmentally sustainable development without this instrument? I think there is an exaggeration. We must find the golden mean. We will have 5 tax rates at most, 3 tax rates, with a lower tax rate for essential goods. In that sense, we may seek for an agreement to approve the tax reform, which will unify taxation on consumption, which already is a true challenge, as Carolina mentioned, due to the federative issues. More than the federative issues, today there's great distrust in the states, a crisis among the states due to the pandemic and the lack of resources. So restrictions of transfers, the lack of clarity about the transfers from the federal governments to states and municipalities. So how do we reach a federative agreement in this context? And it's a radical agreement. It's radical, and as I don't want to take much longer, I would add that Markus Neder is totally right. It's inspired in the European EVAs with rights to broad credit, broad base, but the truth is that this IBS adopts an EVA model that is not the European one, because the European states a differentiation of tax rates and eventually a differentiation of tax rates between goods and services. It adopts the model from New Zealand and it radicalizes the model from New Zealand, because the New Zealand model has a differentiation of tax rates and some types of tax incentives. It proposes the incorporation of this model from New Zealand, which is a unitary country with 5 million people, in Brazil, a country that's unequal regionally. So the chance of approval is trying to find the golden way. So the last thing I would like to say is that I agree that tax incentives do not guarantee a fair distribution of tax burden. But why not? Because it's not through levying consumption that we will promote tax justice. Fiscal justice is achieved through levies on revenue on properties. If taxation is regressive in Brazil, if the tax system is regressive in Brazil with greater burden on the poor, it's because we do not have an adequate taxation on revenues and properties. But that doesn't mean we could at least have some kind of tax incentive for essential goods, considering the economic and social complexity in Brazil, because this is also aligned with a principle in tax law that we call the existential minimum. Everybody has the right to have the minimum to guarantee their survival with reduction taxation. It's not related to tax justice, but this is a choice made in the Constitution of '88 when the social and democratic rule of law was set. It's a difficult answer. What's our better chance? In my opinion, it's to find consensus. I don't think we're moving in this direction because I do not see a distance from the premises, from this dogma of single rate. This is the major concern. Thank you, Tatiane. I would like to follow this line of thought and hand over to Marcos Vinicius so he can share his opinion about the most probable scenario, what will and what will not advance. In my first introduction, I tried not to be pessimistic. The world belongs to the optimists, I believe. But let's talk about the real world. I have witnessed all my life these discussions. People adopting a certain position, Congress members, all the people involved, but in practice, bargaining. I believe the real deadlock now, and the newspapers show it clearly, is that the Congress members are demanding the loss compensation funds, the regional development funds, and the equalization funds. Despite this 10-year-long introduction, that's the deal. It all started with 160 billion, and now the budget amounts to 480 billion. Who will pay this bill? They want it to be paid by the union. This is very difficult. It's the old story back again. We have the winners and the losers. Although they seem to support the reform, what they are really discussing is how the government, and Tatiane explained very well, has that's about 100% of the GDP. We are almost reaching an unsustainable position how can we pay something more? It's very difficult. This is like gambling. Well, I'll give 5% of this fund, but we will have economic growth. That's the gamble. I will have a raise paid in a future revenue. I've seen this happening all the time. This revenue will increase by 20%. And when we do the math in-house, it will barely grow by 2. So how was this possible when the proposal in the Congress mentioned 20% growth? Therefore, this negotiation is very difficult. I don't know, sometimes we have good surprises. One of the major losers will be the municipalities, because I will almost, have one tax rate at 2%. First, the Federal Tax Authority, the federal government, was extremely ambitious. I remember the first estimate for 25 was 9, something for PIS/COFINS, and they started at 12. What will remain for the municipality, which is the less engaged because it's pulverized? Therefore, this is a threat for well-organized municipalities like São Paulo that collect a lot of taxes. There's all this discussion about taxation at the source, at destination, and frequently the most developed states apply this taxation at the source. The fear exists of changing to a new model due to uncertainties. Therefore, the Simplifica Já was created. It was an amendment to the PEC 110, which is completely different to what was being discussed. It's merely a simplified process for the ISS. And I see a mobilized resistance movement contrary to it. This is a difficult movement. Undoubtedly, service is the most thriving sector. As Carolina said, the digital area is the new world. I can dare say that we are reforming the industrial revolution, the industry in chain. Today, this does not exist anymore, no matter where you are. The world has changed. I can live wherever I want. I can work home office. The world is a new world, and service is thriving. Everyone is seeing and wants to participate. Even the Federal Tax Authority wants its share. PIS/COFINS is clearly, in the beginning it was a tax on revenue. I remember in the 80s. It was minimal. Today, PIS/COFINS is one of the highest federal tax collections, higher than the income tax itself. It's an attempt from the Federal Tax Authority to grab a share on the tax on consumption. And Minister Guedes himself said, it's like shooting your foot in this initiative. The problems are the municipalities. Now, this is the scenario. At first, Minister Guedes was favorable to total unification. Lately, it seems he's supporting a dual IVA, launching first CBS, which corresponds to a federal IVA, but not including IPI. But in the program that they did not announce CBS, phase 2 would be the unification of the selective tax and IPI. The idea of having a federal and a municipal tax, and something that the federal government is afraid of, and I've seen it working poorly, are the committees involving the union, the states, and the municipalities. They call it national tax agencies who will control these taxes. This is a complete new world. I remember I once participated, I was a member of the committee for the Simples, which involved, it did not work, or rather it worked poorly. And in the end, the union itself determined everything. To say the truth, to make this committee work is a major challenge of this reform, because there won't be an entity. Imagine to oversee and legislate with all the complexity we have today. Then this is also a major obstacle for this reform. People talk about scenarios, but we will always have the winners. I've seen in the other reform, I followed it up closely. I worked with Bernardo Apio. He was the Secretary of Economic Policy, and he had the support of the governors of the most important states, and they said, I will not support anything. My state will lose if this is approved. So we've seen it before. Therefore, we will face difficulties, although I believe we need to see improvements. If we find someone who's able to make all the arrangements, work with the municipalities, intermediate this bargaining for resources, I do believe, and I'm convinced, that we need a reform. To progress is good, but we need to overcome all these difficulties. Thank you, Marcos. Deloitte recently conducted a survey on the impacts of the tax reform. Carol, can you summarize for us what would be the expectations expressed by those who, in the end, paid the bill, that is, the taxpayers? Yes, Deloitte conducted a survey that we called Text of Tomorrow. 159 companies took part in the survey. The survey was conducted between December 2019 and February 2020, a bit before the pandemic began. And all the questions were related to digital transformation, compliance, and obviously we also talked about tax reform, which is a relevant and urgent topic. From these 159 companies, 71% of respondents hold executive positions, that is, CEO, top management, C-level, and management positions. And to give you an idea of the size of the companies, 43% of them had annual sales higher than 500 million in 2019. This is to give you an overview of the respondents. And now I will talk about what these entrepreneurs and these companies said. Well, the first question we asked was, what are the expectations of the companies in relation to the tax reform? And the expectation number one is the simplification of the tax system, which is something we have been discussing since the beginning of the debate. The second point is to eliminate redundancies in the ancillary obligations. By the way, I remember that in the beginning of the electronic invoice, the SPED, and later Eudaldo will present his point of view, the government was always said that there would be a simplification of the ancillary obligations, right? But what we see is that in some states this did not happen. For instance, some states will operate with GIA. Why do I need GIA if I have tax SPED? This redundancy of ancillary obligations ranks second in the radar of the business community, and they expect it to be solved with the tax reform. Point number 3 is a smaller point for tax compliance. So I won't cover all of them. Later we will share a link of this survey, which is quite comprehensive and long, but I wanted to present just the top 3 issues in relation to the tax reform from the company's point of view. So, when we talk about simplification of taxes, no business owner is considering increasing the tax burden. But a reduction of the tax burden ranked slightly below, which is interesting, right? When we think of this question, the C-level said that the first expectation is smaller costs for compliance, and the second is greater legal security. See that it changes from the C-level and those in the managing positions or even in the operational level. Another interesting point of this survey was a question asked, and maybe I personally was surprised with the answer. The question was, Have you already started to study all the possibilities of the tax reform? Did you already make in-house studies, analysis on the impacts of the current proposals today in the companies? 75% said they didn't. They did not make any study or analysis about the impacts of the tax reform. Although we are not sure about which will be the reform, it would be a mix of PACs anyway. We have nothing defined yet, but I think it's important that all the companies start at least to think how they're going to implement the reform and what will be the potential impacts for the company businesses, right? Another interesting point was a question related to what would be the ideal tax reform. And then, going into what we have already discussed, all of us interested in PACs and CBS, it's interesting to observe that 71% of all respondents prefer the creation of one single IVA, a federal IVA, right? And the remaining 29% believe that the ideal solution would be the creation of a dual IVA. This is very interesting, right? This is the point of view of the business community. Maybe this question is related to the fact that if we have a federal IVA, most likely I will have a smaller compliance to meet this federal IVA instead of two IVAs. So another interesting question was, do you consider that the ideal tax model should include tax incentives or not? And the answer is also very interesting. 61% of business owners think there should exist a tax incentive. Neda is laughing. It serves as a provocation. Everybody loves a little incentive. That's true. So 61% of all businesses owner think it should include a tax incentive. And recapping your point of view, Neder, I agree with you. Today, we have tax incentives. We grant lots of unconstitutional incentives, incentives for an array of sectors. Maybe PEC 45 is at a different level. We go from 80 to 8. So I agree with Tatiani. We should find a midterm. It's feast or famine. Maybe the ideal scenario is to find a middle point, neither stop granting incentives to sectors that are very important, like food, health, and education, nor granting incentives to everybody. This point of view of the business community is very interesting. In relation to the federal selective tax that's mentioned in both PACs, 45 and 110, 58% of the respondents think it's important to have a federal selective tax. This is something interesting that appeared in the survey. Another point that I believe the tax reform should address, and it's not clear yet, was posed by the respondents in the survey. They are concerned with the existing tax credits. Many companies have huge amounts of ICMS, PIS, COFINS, IPI, and today they cannot use these credits. We often say that they cannot monetize these credits and they end up impacting the balance sheet. Frequently, companies need to make provision for these amounts if they do not have a utilization and monetization plan for these credits. And see, this is the greatest potential. 93% of all respondents are worried with these balances, these tax credits, and they think that this anticipated credit, not matter if IBS, CBS, they need to be kept. This is something in the radar of the companies and need to be discussed broadly at the time of the tax reform. And finally, when we asked about the transition period, and Neder put it very well, we have PEC 45 talking about a 10-year transition period. How can we live with a new tax and an old tax system? We have a complicated 10-year period. I dare say we will have a 10-year period of increased tax compliance. We'll need to deal with two completely different realities. Many of you here today will remember when in the 10637 was introduced, the non-cumulative nature of PIS and COFINS in 2003, we had a period of non-cumulative PIS and cumulative COFINS. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're talking only about two taxes here, and I can affirm to you it was highly complicated from the compliance point of view. Just imagine to live with two completely different tax systems on consumption. And as for the transition period, in the survey, 71% of all respondents believe we need 5 years to have a smooth transition to the new model. 11% believe that we need 10 years. And 15% believe that it needs to be deployed immediately. This is also very interesting. Well, these were the points I would like to highlight from the survey, and later I will share the link. Thanks, Carol. I would ask Eudaldo to complement. How ENCATE zeals for the survival of the electronic invoice? How ENCATE sees the challenges posed to tax authorities and taxpayers? As you already mentioned, both sides need adjustments. ENCATE thinks that 6 months transition period provided in the draft bill for CBS is feasible. Sorry, your mic is on the mute. Sorry, there's work here, so I need to turn off the mic. Lots of things were discussed here, and I will try to speak on the time assigned to me. Well, as for timing, our experience in the implementation of the electronic tax documents in Brazil shows that we need a period of time for tax authorities to adjust and integrate the new document in their systems, and also taxpayers need time. So it's reasonable to consider a 3-year period to prepare these systems, do a pilot project, and 3 years later, using the basic tax rate, we would define in the tax system the ideal tax rate for IBS type tax. But there are some very important questions to be asked. The first one relates to tax benefits. I've been working in the last 40 years in the tax management area, and along these 40 years, I discovered that exemptions can't be allowed. When there's a loophole, regardless of how small, which is the issue of tax benefit, you can't control it. Compliance is very difficult in Brazil, mainly due to tax benefits. And here I'm talking, sorry if I'm redundant, about this ICMS. The ICMS has so many exceptions that it's very difficult to explain. There's a professor, Vasco Guimarães. He's a professor from Lisbon. He was my professor in a course organized by the European Union here in Brazil. When we started to study ICMS, we used to explain and explain again. And one day he said to me, Eudaldo, you are very bright. You are able to do something very complicated, extremely complicated. The bylaws of each state have 1,000 articles. It's highly complex. On top of this, you have administrative rules, normative instruction. You add other things, other legislations. Ingenuity is such that I believe only the very smart people would be able to do that. In my point of view, fiscal incentive should be 0. We should have financial incentive, not tax incentive. We should create ways, funds, and each state, each municipality should adopt these ways legally, that is, in regulatory conditions. We would not have this myriad of ADINs, or direct action of unconstitutionality, that we have in Brazil. They promote instability to all companies. How to invest if tomorrow a new ADIN will be approved and will change everything? How a foreign investor can understand that he complied with the law, but the law does not apply anymore? What kind of legal security do we have? That's what we have here. Tomorrow, a new ADIN, an agreement is no longer valid, or a decree, or a state law, or even a protocol signed, because everything is unstable. Tax incentive for me should be 0. Tax rate, we should have very few tax rates, 3 at the most, right? A lower tax rate for services and essential supplies for the population. We should also take that into account, and maybe two other tax rates, one higher and a selective one, and a tax rate that should be applied to the most commodities. And that's it, with no state or municipality autonomy to define new tax rates. Every time we have a loophole, an exception, a possibility, we will have the same scenario. If we conduct a reform along these lines, tomorrow we will be here discussing the same old things from my point of view, because we have a huge capacity to create exceptions. And more, in what concerns simplification and autonomy do not match. Gerson worked with us. We visited Chile, we saw the experience with the electronic invoice, we brought the technology to Brazil, but we implemented it in Brazil in different times. Why different times? Due to autonomy. Big decisions need to be implemented to all taxpayers at the same time. Gerson asked me, how INCAT sees this? We've been thinking, for instance, let's create a Brazilian electronic invoice. Union, states and municipalities, services and goods. Do we have an experience in this? Yes, we do. We did it in Brasilia. Brasilia issues electronic invoices for services and for goods. We could have only two invoices, one for goods, commodities, B2B, and services, and another one simpler for consumer shopping, both goods and services. We do this in Brasilia today. It's not a big deal. Is it doable? Yes, it's doable. And with this, we can unlock the economy. Yes, we can, regardless of the tax reform. But we have the so-called autonomy. I'll give you an example. We started in 2005 and then in 2006, but implementing the electronic invoice, well, we started in 2013 with the consumer invoice. It was the first electronic consumer invoice. It was modern, QR code. We exported the model. Many countries were assisted by Brazilians in the area of electronic invoice. European countries, African countries, Central America, many countries, to have the electronic invoice. Now, what happens? We started in 2013 and some big states implemented in 2020. Why? Because the state is autonomous and electronic invoicing was not considered as the best solution for the moment. But the companies are multi-regional. This increases business costs. This issues compliance. This is one of our proposals. We have created the Nota Fiscal Fácil, a simple invoice. What's that? Low contributory capacity taxpayers will issue a bill of sales using an app, no paper, in their smartphone. When will this happen, Eudaldo? We are doing the pilot project, testing with truck drivers. They are issuing the MDF, an electronic manifest, and the OCTs, the bill of lading. They're doing this today. We do believe that we need to reduce autonomy to simplify, because we are able to do this using a special authorization. Each state will implement according to their criteria. When this will reach all taxpayers in the country, we don't know. Why don't we know? Due to autonomy. Therefore, simplification and autonomy do not match. Any reform we consider to do, we need to take this into account. Tax relief, it's a loophole you open. Therefore, choose financial benefits. That's all. Thank you. Thanks, Eudaldo. The complexity is a huge challenge, so much so when we need to explain the scenario to a foreign investor. And it ends up affecting Brazil because frequently foreign investors decide not to invest in a country that does not offer legal security. Marcos, Carol mentioned that in the survey, 71% of the respondents expect this tax reform to be implemented in 5 years. I would like to explain what is your opinion about the timing. What would be the effectiveness, the transition, the eventual coexistence of PIS, COFINS and CBS, ICMS, IBS simultaneously? What is your opinion? It's an important question. We keep discussing as if the reform would be implemented tomorrow. First, we need to approve IBS, the PEC 45. Only after that, we can start talking about CBS. If we approve the constitutional amendment with 2 rounds of voting at both houses, I think that's even, well, the congressman, I hear the other day the representative Baleia Rossi saying that it would do it this year. I think it's impossible to do it this year, to the country record. And also, it's not self-enforcing. You change the constitution, but it requires the approval of a supplementary law. The authors themselves say it will require at least 2 years to draft and approve a supplementary law. Therefore, first we need to approve the constitutional amendment, which is likely to happen next year. The closer we get to the end of the legislative term, the more difficult it is to get these approvals. And then we have 2 years to discuss the supplementary law, which will already have some versions around. But it's highly complex. And then we start the transition. In the first years, IBS will be at 1% and will reduce proportional tax rates. So in the first 2 years, on top of the existing taxes, we will have the addition of IBS and the selective tax. So complexity will increase. Afterwards, little by little, IBS will start reducing along 8 years, but the others won't. Tax rate will match only after 5 years. This transition will be extremely complicated. Carolina mentioned that ancillary obligations will increase and not the other way around. From a practical point of view, I'm not as old as Eudaldo, but I see the complexity. Sorry for the joke. This complexity is terrible, right? And let's see CBS. CBS was introduced promising to be approved in 6 months, but the urgency disappeared. I see all the Congress members saying they want to have further discussion. There are many people saying the law is unconstitutional. I myself think the Articles 1st and 2nd are unconstitutional. CBS wanted to be an IVA and tax operations, which interferes with the authority of states and municipalities. And to add to this, on the second article, it says that it will tax according to the revenue. We need to define either its operation or its revenue. Apparently, I don't think we can accommodate. And to add to this, we have Article 12. I don't think we have time to discuss this. The old and controversial Article 12 of the law 12173 that discusses gross revenue, including activity revenue. This is highly controversial because it includes other activities which have nothing to do with the operation of goods and services, such as rental, intangible assets, lease operations. So I don't believe the approval of CBS will occur in 6 months, as estimated. I think it's highly complex, especially with a government that does not have majority in the Congress. And this proposal was made by the federal government. I see a long period for the introduction of the UBS, so it would not have an immediate impact next year. We need to approve. It's enforceable without the approval of a supplementary law. And CBS also, I believe, will be postponed for next year after long discussions because it implies a big change. It changes many areas and some need to be improved. Some articles, it seems to me, are unconstitutional. Well, this is a brief summary of the situation. Ana Maciel. Thanks, Marcos. I would like to take this opportunity and ask Tatiane to express her point of view in relation to all was said by Marcos. Tatiane, the floor is yours. Thank you, Gerson. I agree with Marcos. We do not have ambience to approve the proposal of tax reform this year. 1/4 of all Congress members are running for mayors. Campaigns will be launched next month. We are at the end of September, The Congress will be completely empty in the next days. The withdrawal of PL 3887, which contemplates CBS from the urgency list, sends a message that maybe the tax reform is not a priority, and we have a movement for the administrative reform, which was is a potential withdrawal of the government's attempt to approve the tax reform. And indeed, PEC 45, I say that it promises a pot of gold on the other side of the rainbow. Their authors mentioned an increase of 10% of GDP if approved, without deep analysis in this sense, and not taking into account the fact that we have a 10-year transition period. And if this GDP growth really materializes, it will take time and complexity. As Carolina rightly said, we will have two models, two taxes, two ancillary obligations, concurrent litigation. This decentralized model to tax consumption and a centralized model, so it's a bet. Anyway, I think there is a lot of rhetoric and we need to deconstruct it and looking face to face at reality. The supplementary law is of the utmost importance to help us see to what extent IBS goes, which are the contours and so on and so forth. And to CBS, I would like to say that I agree with what Marcus said in the realm of constitutionality or unconstitutionality, and I would like to add another point in addition to Articles 1st and 2nd. Indeed, there is a mismatch between the first and the second articles, because Article 1st, when it mentions the tax, it says it's a contribution on operations of goods and services. It's something similar to ICMS, PIS, and ISS. On the second article, it states that the calculation basis is gross revenue. So we have a problem, right? But I also say that if we apply what we have learned in our classes of tax law, if we confront taxable events and tax base prevails to define what is the taxable event. So if we apply this basic lesson, maybe we can save the tax, even though this is already a problem and it will likely be a source of litigation. Where I see we can't save. And then it corroborates this idea of unconstitutionality. On Article 9 of the draft bill, it talks about the CBS non-cumulative principle. It says that you can claim the credit highlighted in the invoice. What we can dispute is if it needs to be an invoice or not, but leaving this open, but the invoice relating to operations of goods and services, the acquisition. By limiting the right to claim credits to goods and services acquisition, I'm limiting, with no room for doubt, the taxable event. The discourse of the government goes along with this line. I'm creating a non-cumulative tax. Therefore, every time it's levied on, you can claim for credit. But if you can only claim for credit when you buy goods and services, it's only levied in these hypotheses. Therefore, rental operations, for instance, would not be included. And any operation which is not acquisition of goods and services would be excluded. And this corroborates the thesis that it's a tax on operations and not on revenue. And to close this scenario, this interpretation, Paulo Guedes and many other advocates of PEC 45 repeat that the idea is to use CBS as a trial balloon, as a federal IVA, and mix CBS and IBS. Even the name is similar, right? If we utter quickly, we get confused. If I will mix, I can only mix two equal things. I can only mix if the taxable event is the same. This idea of mixing is a huge nonsense because I'm acknowledging that the taxable event for CBS is precisely the same for IBS. That's when unconstitutionality becomes clear, because there's an evasion of taxing power. The taxing power of circulation of goods and provisions of services belongs to the state and municipality governments. So I agree with the discussions around unconstitutionality of CBS, and I say more. It will open room for litigation. Isn't the basic idea to simplify, reduce litigation, and rationalize the business environment in Brazil? I see lots of points here that will allow for litigation. And what I see is government representatives saying, no, that's not it. It's a tax, it's a contribution, a broad-based contribution. It will be levied on everything, and it's not limited to the acquisition of goods and services. This is part of the recitals, but who would enforce? The law is the tax authority, and the tax auditor has a space to levy this way, and it would be more suitable to levy, as I just mentioned. And to add to this, you have the taxpayer with another understanding, and then simplification was simply discarded. This scenario no longer exists. That's it. I think we don't have the right ambience to approve the tax reform this year, and we won't have it in the near future. I think this is positive, because if the CBS draft bill is approved, at the end of the day, we will have more litigation and less simplification. Yes, especially if we take into account what's being proposed, right? But let's talk a bit about good practices. Eudaldo, ENCATE is making some recommendations on the strategies companies should adopt to have less impact on their operations, because these changes, from what I heard here today, will have an impact not only in the issuance of invoices, but also on how to calculate taxes and accounting records. I think that companies need to be extremely cautious and go step by step. The moment is for an evaluation, albeit a summarized one, of the existing proposals. As soon as we have the proposal from the rapporteur, we will have a document to study more thoroughly. And as Marcos Neder said, we still need to wait for the supplementary law, etc., all the operational aspects, but at least we will have something to study in depth. Debates on the rapporteur's proposal is the moment for the big companies to oversee if it's suitable to meet the country's needs. Do we all want a tax reform? Yes, we do. But it can't leave the country in a situation worse than it is today, in terms of complexity, in terms of loopholes, making tax legislation even more complex, among other things. What I commonly see in companies is, first, a perception of what will come from the rapporteur to delve deeply in accordance with the interests of their respective organizations that are different. We have the issue of services, well described by the other panelists. And then on the second moment, of course, it will act at the legislative level. For that, I don't believe in a proposal that will be approved in a short period of time. It seems to me that both the rapporteur and the legislative will see the complexity is greater than what was considered when we talk about a change like this. When we talk, for instance, of financial credit, who will pay that tax? The taxpayer, or it will be withheld by the recipient? Because it might be withheld by the recipient. Then we start considering many things, using PIX and using split in the tax invoice, stating what needs to be paid by the recipient to vendor and what goes to that tax authority, a tax agency, because we don't know what will be this committee that won't be in the accounts of the union, the states or municipalities. But all these are previous studies we're doing, trying to accompany the unfolding of the reform. The states themselves made some proposals through their representatives of amendments to IBS and PEC 45. So there are different ways of seeing this proposal. But what we have for now is that it will take a long time for this reform to impact operations of the companies, because we will have a series of new legislations. So, to make it clear, when I talked about tax relief, I didn't mean tax relief is bad. Tax relief is not bad. It became something bad in the country due to the large amount of reliefs, the lack of control, and the tax war that all of us are well aware of. Not even the companies know how to compete in this market when a new relief is announced in another state or municipality every other day, hindering competition. Just to explain well what I said before. Therefore, we are considering this, using PIX, using split in the tax invoice. We will have only one tax invoice implemented in the whole country. I think this will help unlock the local economy. Taxpayers will have to issue one single tax invoice. We will send the taxpayer the invoice for him to check and make any necessary adjustments. Is there already working in another country? Yes. It works in Chile with a 97% accuracy rate. The taxpayers issues only the tax invoice, and we do what we call assisted statement. Here's your data. Are they correct? Yes, they're correct. Done, that's all. You just have to pay the duty, which you find on the website, how to issue the tax invoice and how to pay taxes. Thanks, Eudaldo. Carolina, I will test now your power of synthesis. The question I will ask gives room for a full-day discussion, but I ask you to summarize. How do you think companies should prepare themselves for these transactions or transitions? In terms of the relevant changes that will come, companies need to accommodate this with the challenges they already face in running their businesses. How should companies prepare themselves? Okay. Although we're going through a period of lots of discussion about the reform projects in the early stages to really understand what's in this CBS or IBS, no matter what will be the final proposal, companies can start preparing themselves, projecting future scenarios, doing a more comprehensive modeling of what would be the impact of each one of the reforms in their strategic planning. We know that companies today need to have a medium and long-term strategic planning, and the tax reform that will come will impact this planning forecasts. It will impact investment planning, business diversification. When I talk about companies that are planning to invest in Brazil, the financial modeling scenario and the return on investments, I think, should consider, even if in general, the impacts these changes will promote in the current scenario, the current tax system, and all the proposals we have today, although we have no certainty about how things will work out. I think it's important for all companies to start considering the potential impacts of these proposals. In the near future, when we have an approval of the supplementary law, which is of the utmost importance. We had a small experience, they'll call it mini reform from the cumulative of the non-cumulative PIS/COFINS. This, at the time, I remember well, generated a lot of work for the companies. Tax changes, although being strictly taxation, they impact the company as a whole. They affect price, structure, negotiation with customers. They affect the price of goods and services, right? Therefore, it's extremely important because this way companies will be able to renegotiate with clients, review contracts, and how to check the costs, services, and all the inputs, and keeping this promise to be quick, Gerson. Modeling also helps companies promote all systemic adaptations. And I invite all companies to start to think to take a look inside and start to understand, well, the tax rules of the current tax system, where are they? They are at RP. Do I have customization? Because with a great deal of customization, we'll likely have more difficulty to implement the new rules. Are my tax rules on a satellite system, in a calculation engine? They should start doing this in-house investigation, because when the approval comes, these companies will have at least a macro plan of how to migrate, what will happen, what's the current scenario, if these tax rules will be included in the ERP or in the calculation engine. What would be the deadline defined by IT for the migration? Many multinational companies depend on the global IT. The local IT can't decide anything. For instance, if I need to add an alteration on SAP, I need to go into a long line that will encompass all the companies in the world. Therefore, it's very important that we start pondering these questions internally. I'll stop now. Thank you, Carol. You were strictly on time. Marcos, in relation to this scenario, or in parallel to this reform scenario, are there any other changes in your radar? What else are you keeping track of? There are some measures that are easier to apply, and I believe they will be approved. The first one, which has been discussed for a long period now, is taxation of dividends. This will have a great impact in all tax relations, because since 1996, our system does not tax dividends. So it will have a major impact. It will impact planning, structures, people organizing themselves as legal entities. It's already part of the structure. Without going into more detail, this measure is more a political measure than an effective one. I remember I took part in the group that decided we were going to tax legal entities 34% or 20%. And they want to reduce the tax burden to 15%. From the tax revenue point of view, it's much better to tax in one single point, because maybe the company may not distribute dividends like in the past, before 1995. That was all the planning. That's why we created the disguised profit distribution and so forth. Litigation was created, and it was simplified when the change was adopted. But people say everybody should pay equally. I'm not convinced that taxing dividends is better than the model we have today. I think exactly the opposite. The model we have today is much better, but I believe it's inevitable, because from the political and structural point of view, it's much better. This will affect many areas. It's a phenomenon we call pejotization, or independent contractors only hiring policy. The hot topic of all the discussions today will lose its advantage. Self-employed professionals organize themselves as a legal person to enjoy a big tax incentive. This will change in the new scenario. And this was one of the most attractive points. When a foreign investor looked for us to discuss investing in Brazil, we had very little to offer. Many bad things, uncertainty, and some good things. We did not tax dividends and interest on working capital. Both of them are skating on thin ice. The other point is the payroll tax reduction. The government has been talking about, not only the minister, but the president himself, constantly talking about this. Yes, we're shooting our feet by overtaxing the payroll. The point is, what's going to replace it? Because it collects a lot. The government can't let go of the revenue at this point with such a huge deficit. And then comes the old discussion about CPMF, or whatever the name they give it. A contribution on payment and a tax rate of 0.8%, which seems to be going back to the past. But from the tax management point of view, this tax is perfect, because its supervision and management is super simple. Banks will do everything. But from the point of view of looking for something better, less cumulative, so much so that the other countries adopted it, they did not. If it was so good, well, these are the short-term scenarios. I have no doubt that dividends taxation needs to be approved until the end of the year, but I don't believe it will to be enforced next year. If it's not approved and I don't see any project, it will be the phase 3 of the proposal of the government, and phase 4 would be reducing payroll tax reduction. This would be a hot topic today. The government needs cash. So CPMF would be an increase in the reserves, payroll tax deduction would foster employment. Brazil has millions of unemployed. So therefore, both of them have potential and can be quickly approved if there is a consensus to enforce them next year. I think this scenario is more likely to happen than this reform we have been discussing. That's all. Thank you, Marcos. Tatiane, would you like to complement what Marcos just said? What major changes are on the radar in the short and medium term future? Well, apart from what Marcos already mentioned, apart from what he just said, it's important to look at fiscal justice because this taxpayers is regressive, higher revenue rather, the less the tax precisely because of the exemption we have today. Therefore, I believe that in terms of improving the structure of the tax system, it would make a huge difference and we would be going towards a more equal tax system. But beyond these questions, I would like to call the attention to something Carol said about the attempt to tax the big IT companies, and it was mentioned briefly on the new tax on financial transactions because it was created with the nickname of digital tax. Paulo Guedes says it was urgent to have such a tax because the digital economy companies are not paying taxes. He even named a few. He mentioned Netflix, Spotify. These companies operate in Brazil and do not pay taxes. Therefore, we need to explore this reality. Then later, he said, and this was mentioned in a newspaper report, and it was only in the Globo newspaper, I don't know if it appeared in other medias, but he said, look, we may have two different things. We may have a broad-based tax on financial transactions like CPMF, even higher than CPMF, but I'm also considering taxing only big IT companies. What in my point of view is a discussion apart from the discussions we have today in Europe. Although this debate exists in Europe at the OECD level, in the pursuit of a consensual solution for taxing the digital economy, their idea is to levy on the income of these companies that operate in certain countries, European countries and also African countries, without being there physically. Therefore, they're trying to levy on the income capacity of these companies due to the fact that these companies explore the consuming market of those countries without paying any tax because they have no physical operation there. Because of the international tax rules, this richness is not explored precisely because they do not have a physical operation, permanent address in these countries. To bring this discussion to Brazil has nothing to do with it because these companies operate here. Most of them have physical presence in Brazil. They pay taxes and other levies in Brazil. Therefore, it's a mistake to say they do not pay taxes, and that's why these legislative initiatives to create a special tax for big IT companies are wrong. But it seems to me that we're moving in this direction because it's interesting. It's like if we were importing thoughtlessly the international discussions without a deep analysis of our reality. It makes no sense at all, but I think it will remain in the agenda how to levy on the income of companies of the digital economy. We need to put this discussion into perspective. I hope we do not start doing suppositions by simply copying the international scenario here. To conclude, it's important that we understand that this dispute about taxing the digital economy, as is occurring around the world, is also a political dispute. There is a dispute between the US and Europe. The US does not want this, to pay taxes in areas where these companies are not physically present because this would affect them. And in this sense, recently the US started supervising, investigating some countries that have created their own taxes on digital companies, among them France, Italy, Spain, and the UK. And all these countries are being investigated by the US Trade Department, as well as countries that are planning to create such taxes like Brazil. So this investigation runs totally apart from the World Trade Organization. It has no connection with WTO. They are under the responsibility of the US government, and American authorities will get to the conclusion if there is any offense to commercial rule. As a result of this initiative, the French government has taken a step back. Why? Because the US said, well, you have created a tax on the digital economy, all fintechs, therefore I will raise tariff barriers to some French products. France took a step back precisely because of this threat. This decision will be taken both in commercial and political terms, and Brazil wants to join this discussion without good reason. We do not need this. We can say, oh, it's difficult. Google advertising revenue goes to Ireland. It's not levied here in Brazil, but we have the Internal Revenue Services to oversee. Therefore, this is the kind of discussion we should engage on, not creating a new tax on digital economy. But to conclude, I believe this will be in the agenda, and we need to pay attention to the context and its relevance. Thanks, Tatiane. Very well described this discussion of taxing the digital. Eudaldo, you talked a little bit about some changes that are being made to tax documents, even prior to the tax reform. Is there something else you want to say about any other changes that are being discussed by ENCATE, by CONFAS, even before the government's tax reform, the IBS, for instance? You're mute. Well, for now, we have the implementation of the Nota Fiscal Fácil, to be issued only by low contributory capacity taxpayers and including 4 tax invoices: electronic invoice, electronic sales invoice, electronic bill of landing, and electronic manifest. This model is being tested with truck drivers. It's an app approved by the tax authorities. It's already approved and being adjusted by CINEF, which is an agreement approved by CONFAS since 2019. Until May, it will include all tax invoices. We are following a defined timeline. What is the easiness of this? Low contributory capacity taxpayers will be able to issue 4 documents with this app, no paper. This is a major step. It's up to date independently of the tax reform. Another important initiative has to do with tax compliance. We're studying a series of taxations for certain items which are used by the taxpayer, certain products, and the idea is we have just deployed the pilot project in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. The state government is making an agreement with all taxpayers. This is our pilot. The idea is that the taxpayer will be sure that he's left correctly or not. Tax compliance in ICMS is extremely complicated, as we already mentioned, but there are companies working with this. So we are partnering with these companies, and our idea is to develop software for taxpayers based on an agreement with CEFAIS to allow it to check if he was taxed correctly. If so, he won't be fearful of receiving a tax deficiency notice. These are the two paths we're following for simplification. These are the most urgent. Thanks, Eudaldo. We are quite advanced on time. It's noon already. We have received several questions prior and during the event. We won't have time to answer all of them. So I take upon myself the responsibility of putting together all these questions and make them circulate among the panelists. No one is obliged to answer. You have already given us time. We will circulate the material, and if you want to add something, we will announce on tax bulletins. I thank you in advance for your cooperation. So let's move to your final remarks. We start with Tatiane. I would like to thank you. It was a great pleasure. As I have mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, this is a very important topic that we need to keep discussing, even though we have been discussing the tax reform since 1995, or I dare say since the enactment of the Constitution of 1988. Constitution. It's something that impacts the whole civil society and should be broadly discussed. Therefore, I would like to thank you once again. It was a great pleasure. Eudaldo, your turn. I would like to thank you for the opportunity and thank the internet users who are attending the discussion. I'm available for further discussions. I believe that when the rapporteur presents a proposal, we will have a lot of things to discuss, and we will be discussing based on something that will be presented by the legislative branch, but due to its importance, as Dr. Tatiane said, we should study it deeply, and we need to help unlock our country, because we're facing a series of complexities that maybe do not exist in other countries. Our tax system is extremely complex. Thanks. Thanks, Carol. Well, before my thanks, I would like to make the last provocation, which is related to the implementation model of this tax reform, which will come. If not next year, it will come sometime. My provocation is aimed at making companies think. Is my model, my current technological solution, the right one? The answer may be yes, or the answer may be no. Having the tax rules today on my ERP makes me an agile company, ready to face the tax reform, face the changes that may or may not come. And what are the alternatives? SAP itself introduced now the SAP for HANA Cloud, where we won't have a tax bra. The model is slightly different. It's a tax service model, which is a connector for calculation engines. What makes SAP, those who deploy, is what we call SAP Vanilla and Standard SAP, easier to be managed when we have global stances, allowing local specificities in Brazil to be dealt as a calculation engine, maybe helping companies to be more agile. Therefore, this is my last provocation for all of you, and once again, I'd like to thank you. It was a great pleasure to be here with you today discussing such an important topic. Thanks. Marcos Vinicius, please. I would like to thank you once again. I think the discussion was very interesting, the way the discussion was organized. It was a discussion full of ideas, and bearing in mind that every day we have a surprise in Brazil. Therefore, We have done here a futurology exercise, but reality surprises us. We need to be alert. Maybe tomorrow we will be discussing completely different things. Destiny will choose another path, but it was extremely interesting. We analyzed the problem from different angles. Thank you all. Thank you, Marcos. I would also like to thank you all for your time, and would like to thank the audience and those who sent us questions. I'm really happy with the level of the comments. From my point of view, the discussion was very rich, and I believe everybody was able to understand the complexities and the nuances of the tax reform at this moment. I would also like to remind you that this webinar was recorded and will be available in this channel at YouTube. But we will send you an email with the link so you can easily access the recording. We will also send another link for you to evaluate this event. The link is already in the chat if you want to anticipate your evaluation. Thank you. I would like to thank once again Tatiane, Carolina, Eudaldo, and Marcos Vinicius. I believe we gave a step forward in this matter. But I would also like to thank Cristiana and Gabriel, who helped us with the organization details, Thais Borges, our partner responsible for Systax commercial area, who was deeply involved with this event, Ana, Fernando, the Vertex team, who were also highly engaged in the organization, the translation team, who translated this event into English. We owe the success of this event to all of you. I hope the event has met your expectations. Please inform us of any point we may improve, as well as send us suggestions for other events like this one discussing other topics. Here at Systax, we have an auditorium. We used to organize 3 to 4 events every month. I hope that very soon after the pandemic, we can meet again, customers and friends, to discuss technical terms in the tax area. It's worth saying that debating is very important, but both for Systax and Vertex, we never neglect practical matters. We work and operate with it every day. We operate using technologies that will bring operational benefits that will help us a lot to adjust to all that might come from these reforms. As a final message, I would like to say, count on us, count on Vertex and Systax teams. And to conclude, today, September 22nd, is the Day of the Accounting Professional and marks the beginning of spring. Thank you all. Have a nice afternoon. I will give the floor now to Fernando. Thank you all, Gerson, Ana, Eudaldo, Tati, Carol, Marcos. It was a great pleasure. I have learned a lot. By nature, I do not belong to the accounting area or the tax area. Therefore, I learned a great deal in these last 2 hours. Thank you very much for your time and engagement. Time is our greatest asset today, and as Marcos said, this is just the beginning of this journey. I believe we will have room to continue debating in the coming months, maybe years. That's it. Thank you all. Thank you, and see you next meeting. Good day to you all.